Sometimes the deepest grief can lead to the most unexpected purpose. When a man loses everything he holds dear, the last thing he expects is to find a reason to keep going. In the 1800s, a grieving cowboy who had just buried his beloved wife received word that he had inherited a forgotten ranch on the outskirts of town. Expecting only dust and broken fences, he rode through its gates and froze in disbelief. More than 200 starving, abandoned animals still roamed the land, waiting for care. With nothing but his sorrow and grit to guide him, the cowboy vowed to restore the ranch, and in saving the animals, he found a reason to save himself. Could one broken man truly save them all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Millfield, Texas, but Thomas McKenna felt nothing of its warmth. He sat hunched on the edge of his hotel bed, rolling the worn leather journal between his calloused hands, like a man handling something both precious and painful. 6 months had passed since Sarah's funeral, yet the journal still carried the faint scent of her lavender soap, a ghost of comfort that made his chest tighten with each breath. Tom had read every word Sarah had written in that journal at least a dozen times. Her careful script filled page after page with dreams he'd never known she harbored so deeply. Dreams of a proper ranch where they could raise more than cattle. Dreams of taking in stray animals, the broken and abandoned creatures that wandered. The frontier towns looking for scraps and shelter. Every living thing deserves a chance, she'd written. Even the most forgotten ones can heal if someone just takes the time to care. He closed the journal and set it gently on the rough wooden nightstand. Outside his window, the town of Millfield was stirring to life. Wagons creaked along the rutted street. Horses nickered at the hitching posts, and the distant sound of hammer on anvil rang from the blacksmith shop. It was a sound Tom knew well from countless frontier towns just like this one, where he'd taken work over the past half-year since Sarah's death. Work. That was all his life had become. One ranch job after another, moving from place to place like tumbleweed, never staying long enough to form attachments or face questions about his past. He was good with cattle, good with horses, and ranch owners were always in need of experienced hands who didn't ask for much beyond fair wages and a place to sleep. Tom asked for nothing more because he wanted nothing more. Purpose had died with Sarah, leaving only the mechanical routine of survival. The fever had taken her in less than a week. One day she was laughing at his clumsy attempts to fix the cabin's leaky roof, and the next she was burning up with sickness, delirious with fever that no amount of cool cloths or whispered prayers could break. The town doctor had done what he could, but frontier medicine had its limits, and Sarah's limits came too soon. Tom had held her hand as her breathing grew shallow, promising her things he now couldn't remember through the haze of his own desperation. After the burial, Tom had sold their small homestead and everything in it except for Sarah's clothes, her Bible, and the leather journal she'd kept since their wedding day. He'd loaded his horse and what few possessions he could carry, and he'd ridden away from the life they'd built together. Looking back felt like staring into the sun, painful and impossible to sustain. That was 6 months ago. 6 months of drifting from job to job, town to town, carrying his grief like a stone in his chest. He'd worked ranches in New Mexico, Colorado, and now Texas, always moving when the work ended or when someone got too curious about the sadness that seemed to follow him like his own shadow. Tom had become skilled at avoiding conversations that drifted toward personal territory, deflecting questions with practical talk about cattle, weather, or the day's work ahead. The knock on his door came at precisely 8 o'clock, just as Mrs. Henderson had promised. She was the owner of Millfield's boarding house, a sturdy woman with grey-streaked hair and the kind of maternal instincts that made her impossible to ignore. "Mr. McKenna," she called through the door, "there's a gentleman here to see you. Says he's got legal business to discuss." Tom frowned and opened the door to find Mrs. Henderson standing beside a thin man in a black suit holding a leather satchel. The stranger had the pale complexion of someone who spent his days indoors, and his spectacles caught the light from the hallway window. "Mr. McKenna, I'm Harold Whitman, attorney at law from Austin. I've been looking for you for quite some time." The lawyer's voice carried the educated accent of someone who'd received formal schooling back east. "I have a matter concerning an inheritance that requires your immediate attention." Tom stared at the man, his mind struggling to process the words. Inheritance. He had no family left, no relatives who might remember him in their final wishes. His parents had died when he was young, and Sarah had been an only child whose parents passed years before their marriage. "I think you have the wrong man," Tom said finally. "I don't have any family left who'd be leaving me anything." Mr. Whitman consulted a document from his satchel. Thomas William McKenna, born 1835, married to Sarah Elizabeth Porter in 1858. When Tom nodded slowly, the lawyer continued, "Then you are indeed the man I seek. Your great-uncle, Jeremiah McKenna, passed away 3 months ago and named you as his sole heir." "Uncle Jeremiah?" Tom's voice came out rougher than he intended. The name stirred old memories, fragments of childhood stories his father had told, about his eccentric older brother who'd headed west when Tom was barely walking. "I haven't seen him since I was a boy. I thought he was dead." "Very much alive until recently, and quite prosperous by frontier standards." Mr. Whitman pulled out a thick envelope sealed with red wax. He owned a considerable spread called the Blackwater Ranch, about 15 miles north of here. According to his will, he specifically requested that you inherit the property and all its contents. Tom took the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. The wax seal bore the impression of a horseshoe, and his name was written across the front in unfamiliar handwriting. "Why me? We never had any contact." "I don't understand." The lawyer adjusted his spectacles. "Your uncle's instructions were quite specific, though he didn't elaborate on his reasoning. He simply stated that you were to inherit everything, and that you should visit the property as soon as possible after his death. He seemed to believe you would understand once you saw the ranch." Mrs. Henderson had been listening from a respectful distance, but now she stepped forward. "Begging your pardon, Mr. McKenna, but the Blackwater Ranch has been abandoned for years. Folks in town say it's been empty since old Jeremiah took sick and couldn't manage it anymore." Mr. Whitman nodded. "That aligns with what I know. Mr. McKenna, Senior became quite reclusive in his final years. The property has been unattended for some time, but it legally belongs to you now." He handed Tom a heavy iron key. "This should open the main gate and the ranch house. I do recommend you inspect the property soon, as there may be matters requiring your attention." After the lawyer left, Tom sat alone in his room, turning the key over in his hands. It was old and worn smooth, the metal darkened with age and use. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its size, as if it carried more than just the ability to open locks. He opened Sarah's journal again, though he hardly needed to read the words anymore. They were carved into his memory like scripture. Her dreams of a place where abandoned animals could find sanctuary. Her gentle philosophies about the connection between caring for helpless creatures and healing one's own wounded spirit. "I believe God puts opportunities in our path," she'd written one evening, after they'd taken in a half-starved dog that had wandered onto their homestead. "Sometimes the thing we think we're saving ends up saving us instead." Tom had always admired Sarah's faith, even when his own felt shaky. She saw providence where he saw coincidence, hope where he saw mere circumstance. But sitting in that boarding house room, holding the key to a ranch he'd never seen, inherited from an uncle he barely remembered, Tom felt something stir in his chest that hadn't moved in 6 months. Sheriff Clayton knocked on Tom's door just after noon. He was a man Tom's age, with steel-grey hair and the measured way of speaking that came from years of dealing with trouble before it escalated. They'd spoken briefly when Tom first arrived in town, the kind of conversation that established a working man's credentials and confirmed he wasn't looking for trouble. "Heard you came into some property," Clayton said, settling into the room's single chair. "Thought you might want to know what you're getting into before you ride out there." Tom poured coffee from the pot Mrs. Henderson had left and handed a cup to the sheriff. "What can you tell me about the Blackwater Ranch?" Clayton sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Your uncle was a good man, but he got strange toward the end. Started talking about responsibilities that didn't make much sense to folks. Kept saying he had promises to keep, but he wouldn't say to who." The sheriff paused, studying Tom's face. "Place has been empty for near 2 years now. Might be rough seeing it neglected like that." "I appreciate the warning," Tom said, "but I need to see what I've inherited." Clayton nodded. "I figured as much. Just wanted you to know that if you decide the place is too much trouble, there are buyers who'd take it off your hands. Good grazing land, decent water rights, could set you up comfortable if you wanted to move on." The suggestion should have been tempting. Tom had no ties to this place, no particular reason to stay, but something about the sheriff's words, about the idea of selling, before he'd even seen what Uncle Jeremiah had left him, felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. That evening, Tom packed his few belongings and prepared for the ride to Blackwater Ranch. He strapped Sarah's journal into his saddlebags alongside his spare clothes and the tools of his trade. The key to his inheritance hung on a leather cord around his neck, next to the simple gold wedding ring he'd worn on a chain since Sarah's death. As he prepared to leave Millfield, Tom found himself thinking about Sarah's faith in Providence, in the idea that events were connected by threads too subtle for most people to see. He didn't know if he believed in such things anymore, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this inheritance was more than coincidence. Tomorrow he would ride to Blackwater Ranch and see what his great-uncle had left him. Tonight he would read Sarah's journal one more time and try to imagine what she would have made of this unexpected turn in his journey. The ride to Blackwater Ranch took Tom through countryside that grew wilder with each mile. The well-traveled road from Millfield gradually narrowed to a dirt track, then to little more than wagon ruts carved through prairie grass that swayed shoulder-high in the morning breeze. Tom's horse, a reliable bay gelding named Chester, picked his way carefully along the uneven path, ears swiveling at the sounds of insects and distant bird calls. Tom had left town before dawn, hoping to reach the ranch by mid-morning and have most of the day to survey what he'd inherited. The lawyer's envelope rested in his saddlebag alongside Sarah's journal, both documents representing different chapters of a life that felt increasingly disconnected from the man he'd become. The key to the ranch gate hung heavy against his chest, warming against his skin as the sun climbed higher. The first glimpse of Blackwater Ranch came as Tom crested a low hill dotted with mesquite trees. Below him spread a valley that must have once been carefully managed, with neat fence lines and organized pastures. Now, those fences sagged and leaned at odd angles, and the pastures had grown wild with native grass and scattered wildflowers. The ranch building sat clustered at the valley's heart, a 2-story house with a wraparound porch, a large barn with weathered red paint, and several smaller outbuildings that looked like they'd seen better days. But it was the gate that stopped Tom short. The entrance to the property was marked by 2 tall posts topped with carved horse heads, connected by an iron arch that spelled out Blackwater Ranch, in letters that had once been painted white. The gate itself was a masterpiece of wrought ironwork, featuring intertwined horseshoes and cattle brands, in a pattern that must have taken a skilled blacksmith considerable time to craft. Yet the beautiful metalwork was secured with a chain and padlock so rusted that Tom wondered if the key around his neck would even fit. He dismounted and approached the gate with the reverence the craftsmanship deserved. The key slid into the lock after some coaxing, and the mechanism turned with a grinding protest that sent a small shower of rust flakes to the ground. As the chain fell away and Tom pushed open the gate, he felt a weight he hadn't expected. This wasn't just opening a lock, it was accepting responsibility for whatever lay beyond. Chester snorted and sidestepped as they passed through the gate, and Tom found himself sharing the horse's nervousness. The ranch felt too quiet, with an expectant stillness that made the hair on his arms stand up. He'd expected abandonment, perhaps the melancholy of a place left to time and weather. Instead, there was something in the air that suggested watchful presence. The main path to the ranch house was overgrown but still clearly defined, winding between pastures where knee-high grass waved in patterns that suggested hidden movement. Tom guided Chester at a walking pace, taking in the details of neglect that were visible everywhere. Broken fence posts, a water trough turned on its side, pieces of farm equipment left scattered as if their operator had simply walked away mid-task. Then he heard it, a sound so unexpected that he reined Chester to a complete stop. A horse's whinny, clear and strong, coming from somewhere ahead. Tom sat perfectly still in his saddle, listening, wondering if his mind was playing tricks on him. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by what sounded like an answering call from another direction. Tom's heart began to beat faster. Sheriff Clayton had said the ranch was abandoned, empty. But horses didn't whinny at nothing, and the sounds he was hearing suggested more than one animal. He urged Chester forward, following the main path as it curved around a stand of oak trees and opened into a wide clearing before the ranch house. What Tom saw there defied every assumption he'd made about his inheritance. Animals. Dozens of them, scattered across what had once been the main yard and the pastures beyond. Horses grazing near the barn, their ribs showing, but their eyes alert and watchful. Cattle clustered around a stock tank that somehow still held water, their coats dull, but their bearing suggesting they were far from wild. Chickens pecked at the ground near what must have been a coop, and he could see pigs rooting in a pen beside the barn that looked makeshift but functional. Tom dismounted on unsteady legs, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. These weren't wild animals that had wandered onto abandoned property. These were domestic creatures, thin but not starving, wary but not feral. They showed signs of having been cared for, even if that care had been interrupted. A movement near. The ranch house caught his attention, and Tom turned to see a mare approaching with slow, careful steps. She was grey with age, her mane silvered and her gait showing the stiffness of advanced years, but her eyes held an intelligence that made Tom's breath catch. She stopped just beyond arm's reach and studied him with the kind of assessment that suggested she was making a decision about his character. "Easy, girl," Tom said softly, extending his hand palm up in the universal gesture of peace. The mare stepped closer, close enough for Tom to see the careful way she moved, the slight favor she showed her left front leg, close enough to see that despite her age and obvious hardship, someone had loved this animal. Her mane had been braided, recently enough that traces of the pattern still showed, and there was a gentle quality in her approach that spoke of trust in humans. The mare allowed Tom to stroke her neck, and as he did, more animals began to move closer. Not rushing, not threatening, but approaching with the kind of hope that suggested they recognized him as potentially helpful. A dog emerged from under the ranch house porch, tail wagging cautiously. Chickens began to cluster around his feet, pecking at the ground but clearly aware of his presence. Tom felt his legs growing weak as the full scope of what he was seeing became clear. This wasn't just a few stray animals that had wandered onto abandoned property. This was a substantial population of domestic creatures who had somehow survived without human care, or with minimal care, for longer than should have been possible. How? "Many of you are there?" he whispered, as much to himself as to the grey mare who continued to accept his gentle touches. As if in answer to his question, more animals became visible. Sheep, he hadn't noticed before, emerged from behind the barn. More cattle appeared at the edge of his vision. The chickens he'd initially counted as maybe a dozen turned out to be closer to 30, as they ventured from various hiding spots around the property. The enormity of the situation settled on Tom's shoulders like a physical weight. These animals, needed care, food, water, medical attention, shelter maintenance. They needed someone to take responsibility for their welfare, and by virtue of inheritance, that someone was him. The animals seemed to sense his presence as significant, gathering closer with an expectation that both touched and terrified him. Tom thought of Sarah's journal, of her dreams about providing sanctuary for abandoned creatures. The irony was almost overwhelming. Here he was, a man who could barely care for himself in his grief, suddenly responsible for what appeared to be well over 100 animals who had somehow been waiting for exactly this moment. The grey mare nudged his shoulder gently, as if encouraging him to make a decision. Around him, the other animals continued their cautious approach, creating a circle of patient, hopeful faces. Tom realized that whatever choice he made in the next few moments would determine not just his own future, but the fate of every creature surrounding him. He pulled the ranch gate key from around his neck and held it in his palm, studying the worn metal that had just unlocked far more than he'd bargained for. Behind him, Chester whinnied softly, as if reminding him that retreat was still possible. Ahead of him, the grey mare waited with the infinite patience of a creature who had learned to hope despite disappointment. Tom closed his fist around the key and made his choice. Tom's first priority was water. The animals had clearly found sources. They weren't showing signs of severe dehydration, but he needed to understand how they'd been surviving and ensure those sources were reliable. Following the grey mare, who seemed to have appointed herself as his guide, Tom discovered a network of water systems that spoke of careful planning and recent maintenance. Behind the main barn, he found the first revelation, a series of hand-carved wooden troughs arranged in a configuration that allowed gravity to feed water from one to the next. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each trough hewn from single pieces of oak and fitted with iron bands that showed minimal rust despite obvious age. The largest trough, positioned to catch rainwater from the barn roof, bore carved initials, J.M. 1878, Uncle Jeremiah's mark from when he'd built this place. But it was the evidence of recent care that made Tom's hands tremble as he examined the system. The troughs had been cleaned recently, cleared of debris and algae. Simple wooden plugs allowed the water flow to be controlled between levels, and those plugs showed wear from recent use. Someone had been maintaining this system, keeping it functional even as the ranch appeared abandoned. The grey mare, Tom had started thinking of her as Belle, though he didn't know where the name came from, led him to other discoveries. Makeshift feeding stations constructed from whatever materials were available. Old wagon beds filled with hay. Feed scattered on canvas sheets weighted down with stones. Salt licks positioned strategically throughout the property. None of it was professional ranching equipment, but all of it showed the ingenuity of someone who cared deeply about the animals' welfare. As Tom explored, he began to understand the scope of what he'd inherited. By his rough count, there were at least 30 horses of various ages and conditions, 50 head of cattle, perhaps 80 sheep, countless chickens, a dozen pigs, and what appeared to be several goats hiding in the more remote areas of the property. Every animal showed signs of having been cared for within recent memory, yet none showed the sleek condition of animals receiving proper daily attention. The barn provided another surprise. Tom expected to find empty stalls and dusty equipment, but instead discovered that the building was still partially functional. Several stalls contained fresh bedding, water buckets that had been recently filled, and feeding stations that showed signs of regular use. In the tack room, he found equipment that had been maintained and organized, including bridles and halters that would be necessary for handling the horses. Most surprising of all was a notebook hanging from a nail beside the barn door. The pages were weathered, and the handwriting was shaky, but the entries were recent, some dated just 2 weeks ago. The notes were brief but telling. Fed hay to the horses in the north pasture. Belle is favoring her left front leg again. The red cow had her calf, both doing well. Need to repair the fence near the creek. Tom read through the entries with growing amazement and confusion. Someone had been caring for these animals until very recently. Someone who knew them individually and tracked their needs with dedication. But who? And where were they now? His question was partially answered when he found a small cabin about a quarter-mile from the main ranch house. The structure was little more than a shack, but it had been lived in recently. A simple bed, a wood-burning stove, basic cooking utensils, and clothes that suggested an older man of small stature. On the cabin's single table, Tom found more notebooks filled with animal observations and care instructions, along with a letter addressed to whoever comes next. The letter was brief and written in the same shaky handwriting as the barn notebook. My name is William Santos. I worked for Mr. McKenna for 15 years before he passed. He made me promise to keep caring for the animals until his heir arrived. I did my best, but my health is failing, and I can't continue. The animals trust humans because of Mr. McKenna's kindness and my care, but they will need someone strong to manage properly. They deserve better than I can give them now. I pray whoever inherits this place has the heart to see what Mr. McKenna saw in these creatures, that every living thing deserves a chance. I have gone to live with my daughter in San Antonio. The animals are waiting. Tom sat heavily on the cabin's single chair, the letter trembling in his hands. Uncle Jeremiah had arranged for the animals' care even after his death, asking this loyal worker to maintain them until Tom could take over. But William Santos was gone now, and Tom was faced with the full weight of responsibility. As evening approached, Tom realized he'd spent the entire day exploring and had barely begun to address the animals' immediate needs. Many were approaching, the feeding stations he'd discovered, looking at him with expectant eyes. The horses were gathering near the barn, following some routine that had been established over years of care. Tom had brought supplies for a brief inspection trip, not for taking over an entire ranch operation. His saddlebags contained jerky, hardtack, and coffee, nothing suitable for feeding dozens of hungry animals. But as he watched Belle approach the barn with her characteristic careful gait, followed by several other horses who clearly looked to her for leadership, Tom felt something shift inside him. He opened his saddlebags and retrieved what feed he could find in the barn, supplementing it with hay from a stack that William Santos had apparently maintained. The process of feeding the horses felt natural, familiar from years of ranch work, but there was something different about this interaction. These animals weren't just livestock. They had personalities, relationships with each other, and what seemed like genuine gratitude for his attention. As Tom worked, muscle memory from years of ranch work took over, but deeper memories surfaced. As well, he remembered Sarah hand-feeding orphaned calves on their small homestead, the gentle way she spoke to frightened animals, her patience with creatures that others had given up on. "They know when someone cares," she'd told him once. "Animals can sense love just like people can." That night, Tom made his bed on the porch of the main ranch house, unwilling to enter the building until he'd had time to process what he'd discovered. He lay on his bedroll, listening to the sounds of the ranch at night. Horses moving quietly in the pasture, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of smaller animals going about their nocturnal business. For the first time in 6 months, Tom fell asleep to sounds other than his own grief. The animals of Blackwater Ranch had accepted his presence, and despite his intention to assess the property and make arrangements to sell it, he found himself already thinking about tomorrow's feeding schedule and which animals needed his attention. First, Tom's second morning at Blackwater Ranch began with Belle's gentle nudging at his shoulder. The old mare had apparently decided that sunrise meant feeding time, and she wasn't about to let him sleep through his responsibilities. As Tom sat up on the porch, stretching muscles sore from sleeping on hard planking, he found himself surrounded by expectant faces. Horses, cattle, and even some of the bolder chickens had gathered in the yard, creating an impromptu welcoming committee. After tending to the morning feeding routine that was quickly becoming familiar, Tom decided it was time to explore the ranch house itself. The front door key was on the same ring as the gate key, and it turned more smoothly, suggesting this lock had been used more recently. The door swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing an interior that was dusty but surprisingly well-preserved. The main room was furnished simply but comfortably, with handmade furniture that showed the marks of careful craftsmanship. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel decorated with carved wooden horses that matched the style of the gateposts. But it was the collection of photographs on the side table that caught Tom's attention and held it. The largest photograph showed a family of 4 standing in front of the very house Tom now occupied. A man and woman in their 30s, flanked by 2 children who couldn't have been older than 10. The photograph was professionally done, probably taken in a town studio, but someone had hand-tinted portions of it with delicate watercolors. The woman's dress was touched with pale blue, the man's vest with burgundy, and the children's clothing with soft yellows and greens. Beneath the photograph, written in careful script on a piece of paper that had been pressed under glass, was an inscription: "The Hartwell family, James, Margaret, Thomas and Sarah, Blackwater Ranch, 1869. Tom stared at the names, his heart catching on the familiar sounds. Thomas and Sarah, the same names he and his wife had shared, captured in this stranger's family portrait from more than a decade ago. As Tom explored further, he found more evidence of the Hartwell family's life at Blackwater Ranch. A child's wooden toy horse sat on a windowsill, carved with the same skilled hands that had crafted the feeding troughs. A woman's sewing basket contained thread and fabric that suggested interrupted projects. In what must have been the master bedroom, Tom discovered a man's clothing still hanging in a wardrobe and a woman's vanity table with a silver-backed brush, set arranged as if waiting for morning use. The story of what had happened to the Hartwells emerged as Tom continued his exploration. In a desk drawer, he found newspaper clippings from 1871 that told the grim tale, "Influenza claims entire family." The article was brief but devastating. The disease had swept through the region that winter, and the isolated ranch families had been particularly vulnerable. James Hartwell and his wife Margaret had succumbed first, leaving their children orphaned. The children had lasted only days longer before the same illness took them, but the newspaper clipping revealed something else that made Tom's hands tremble as he read, "The Hartwell Ranch, with its considerable livestock holdings, will be managed by James Hartwell's business partner Jeremiah McKenna until such time as appropriate arrangements can be made for the property's disposition." Uncle Jeremiah had inherited the ranch and its animals after tragedy struck, just as Tom was inheriting it now. A leather-bound ledger provided more details about how Uncle Jeremiah had managed the transition. His careful records showed that he'd kept all of the Hartwell animals, adding to them over the years until the ranch supported the large population Tom had discovered. More importantly, the ledger revealed Uncle Jeremiah's philosophy about the animals' care. These creatures survived the loss of the Hartwell family because they learned to depend on each other as much as on humans. They have wisdom about survival that we should respect. Tom spent the afternoon putting this new understanding into practice as he observed the animals more carefully. He began to see the social structures that had developed among them. Belle was clearly the leader among the horses, but her authority was gentle, more maternal than domineering. The cattle followed the lead of a massive bull with graying around his muzzle, who moved his charges to water and shade with quiet efficiency. Even the chickens showed patterns of organization, with certain hens taking responsibility for protecting the younger birds. As he watched, Tom began to understand how the animals had survived William Santos's departure. They had established routines and hierarchies that allowed them to function as a community. They knew where to find water, where to shelter from weather, and how to protect each other from predators. His role wasn't to impose order on chaos, but to support a system that was already working. This realization came just in time, because Tom's third day brought his first major crisis. He woke to find Belle pacing anxiously near the barn, whinnying in a pattern that seemed urgent. When Tom investigated, he discovered that 3 of the cattle were showing signs of serious illness: labored breathing, discharge from their eyes and noses, and the listless behavior that experienced ranchers learned to fear. Tom had seen cattle sickness before, and he knew that what he was observing could spread quickly through the entire herd if not addressed immediately. But treating sick cattle required more than good intentions. It required medicine, equipment, and knowledge he wasn't sure he possessed. The nearest veterinarian was probably in Millfield, a day's ride away, and Tom wasn't certain the sick animals could wait that long. That evening, as Tom sat on the porch considering his options, he pulled out paper and pen to write a letter he'd been composing in his mind since his arrival. The letter was addressed to Sarah's grave back in Colorado, a practice he'd maintained sporadically since her death. "My dearest Sarah, I find myself in a situation you would have loved, and I'm terrified. I've inherited a ranch with more than 200 animals, all of them depending on me for their survival. Today I discovered that 3 cattle are sick, and I don't know if I have the knowledge to help them. I keep thinking about what you wrote in your journal about every living thing deserving a chance. These animals have been waiting for someone to care for them, and I'm not sure I'm the right person for this responsibility, but I'm the person who's here. And I can hear you telling me that sometimes that's enough. I miss your wisdom, Sarah. I miss your certainty that love can overcome any challenge. Tomorrow I'll ride to town for medicine and advice. Tonight I'll sit with the sick animals and try to be the man you believed I could be." As Tom sealed the letter, Belle approached the porch and stood quietly beside the steps. In the moonlight, her grey coat looked silver, and her dark eyes reflected a patience that seemed to span years of waiting. Tom reached out to stroke her neck, and for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt the beginning of something that might eventually become hope. Tom's emergency ride to Millfield began before dawn, with the image of 3 sick cattle weighing heavily on his mind. He'd left Belle in charge of the other horses, a responsibility she seemed to accept with the gravity it deserved. The ride felt longer than usual, as Tom fought against his own inexperience and the ticking clock of animal illness. At the general store, Tom's request for veterinary supplies earned him skeptical looks from both the proprietor and the handful of early customers. Word had apparently spread about the strange inheritance and the man who'd taken responsibility for a ranch full of abandoned animals. "You sure you know what you're dealing with out there, McKenna?" asked a rancher named Garrett, whose tone carried more doubt than malice. "Cattle sickness can spread faster than wildfire, and if you don't handle it right, you could lose the whole herd." Tom purchased what supplies the store had: basic medicines, eye treatments, and fever reducers that the store owner assured him might help. But he knew he was operating beyond his knowledge. It was Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house who provided the information that would change everything. "If you need someone who knows animal medicine, you should talk to Dr. Morrison," she said, as Tom prepared to leave town. "She's the only physician we've got, but she treats animals too, when folks can't afford to send to Austin for a veterinarian." Dr. Elizabeth Morrison's office occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building on Millfield's main street. Tom found her tending to a young boy with a badly scraped knee, speaking to both the child and his worried mother with the kind of calm authority that immediately put people at ease. She was perhaps 40 years old, with prematurely grey hair pulled back in a practical style and hands that moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to healing. When Tom explained his situation, Dr. Morrison listened without interruption, asking pointed questions about the cattle's symptoms and the timeline of their illness. Her questions revealed a depth of knowledge about animal medicine that surprised Tom, given that she was trained as a physician. Respiratory illness in cattle can be several things, she said, pulling a worn leather medical bag from a cabinet. The symptoms you describe sound like they could be shipping fever, though it's unusual to see it in animals that haven't been transported recently. She paused, studying Tom's face. You said you inherited over 200 animals? That's a substantial responsibility. More than I bargained for, Tom admitted. I'm learning as I go, and I'm afraid I'm going to make mistakes that cost lives. Dr. Morrison smiled, the expression transforming her serious features. The fact that you're worried about making mistakes tells me you're probably the right person for the job. Let me gather some supplies and ride out with you. I haven't been to the Blackwater Ranch in years, and I'm curious to see what condition those animals are in. The ride back to the ranch gave Tom his first extended conversation with another person since Sarah's death. Dr. Morrison had come west from Philadelphia after completing her medical training, drawn by the frontier's need for physicians and her own desire for independence. She'd been in Millfield for 8 years, long enough to know Uncle Jeremiah and to remember the Hartwell family tragedy. Your uncle was a remarkable man, she told Tom as they rode. He never married, never had children of his own, but he cared for those animals like they were family. When William Santos got too old to help properly, Jeremiah would ride into town every few weeks asking for my advice about animal ailments. At the ranch, Dr. Morrison's examination of the sick cattle was thorough and methodical. She took their temperatures, listened to their breathing, and examined their eyes and noses with the same careful attention Tom had seen her give the injured. Boy, her diagnosis was both reassuring and concerning. It's not shipping fever, she said, cleaning her instruments with practiced efficiency. More likely a respiratory infection that's been brewing for a while. The good news is that it's treatable, if we act quickly. The challenging news is that you'll need to administer medication twice daily for at least a week and monitor the entire herd for signs of spread. Dr. Morrison opened a worn leather case that Tom hadn't noticed her carrying. Inside, organized, with military precision, were veterinary tools and medicines that looked well used but carefully maintained. This was your uncle's, she explained. He left it with me when he became too sick to use it himself, asked me to give it to whoever took over the ranch. The medical kit was a revelation. Uncle Jeremiah had equipped himself to handle most common animal ailments, from respiratory infections to birthing complications to injury treatment. Each tool was labeled with careful handwriting, and a notebook tucked into the case contained detailed instructions for treatments, dosages, and procedures. Over the following week, Dr. Morrison visited the ranch daily, teaching Tom how to use the medical equipment and guiding him through the cattle treatment process. Her presence brought more than just medical expertise. She brought human conversation and the gradual development of friendship that Tom hadn't realized he needed. As the cattle recovered, Tom's daily routine expanded beyond basic feeding and watering. Morning meant checking on sick animals and administering treatments. Afternoons were devoted to repairs, fixing fence posts, clearing water channels, and maintaining the feeding stations that kept the ranch community functioning. Evenings belonged to reading, usually from Sarah's journal, but increasingly from Uncle Jeremiah's veterinary notes and Dr. Morrison's medical advice. It was during one of these evening reading sessions that Tom discovered a passage in Sarah's journal that made his hands shake. Tom doesn't know yet, but I've been writing to his Uncle Jeremiah in Texas. I told him about my dreams of having a proper ranch where we could take in animals that need homes. He wrote back that he understands that calling and that he's doing the same thing at his place. I think Tom and his uncle are more alike than Tom realizes. They both have hearts big enough for creatures that others have given up on. Tom read the passage 3 times, trying to understand the implications. Sarah had been in contact with Uncle Jeremiah. She'd shared her dreams with him. The inheritance wasn't random. It was planned, orchestrated by a woman who'd seen something in Tom that he was only beginning to see in himself. His growing sense of purpose was interrupted by a new crisis. Tom woke one morning to find several chickens missing and signs of a struggle near their coop. Tracks in the dirt told the story of nocturnal predators, probably coyotes, who discovered the ranch's vulnerable populations. The remaining chickens huddled together in obvious terror, and Tom realized that learning to heal sick animals was only part of his responsibility. He would also have to learn to protect them. Tom's battle against the coyotes began with reinforcing the chicken coop, but it evolved into a comprehensive improvement of the ranch's protective structures. Working with materials salvaged from collapsed outbuildings and lumber purchased during his increasingly frequent trips to town, he spent his days building higher fences, stronger gates, and secure nighttime shelters for the most vulnerable animals. It was while repairing a torn section of the chicken coop that Tom discovered Sarah's sewing kit tucked away in the ranch house's main bedroom. The discovery stopped him cold, not because he'd forgotten about it, but because he'd packed it so carefully. When he sold their homestead, that finding it here felt impossible. Then he remembered. He'd left it in his saddlebags and hadn't unpacked completely since arriving at the ranch. The sewing kit contained more than needles and thread. It held fabric scraps from every dress Sarah had owned, buttons she'd saved from worn-out garments, and small pieces of projects she'd never finished. Tom found himself using the strongest thread to mend tears in horse blankets he'd found stored in the barn, creating patches from Sarah's fabric scraps that added unexpected color to the ranch's utilitarian landscape. Dr. Morrison noticed the changes during one of her weekly visits. "You've been busy," she observed, watching Tom apply a patch made from Sarah's blue gingham dress to a blanket that would keep one of the older horses warm through the coming winter nights. "The animals look better fed, better cared for. You're developing quite a reputation in town. Good or bad?" Tom asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer from the looks he'd been receiving during his supply runs. "Mixed," Dr. Morrison admitted. "Some folks think you're doing something admirable out here. Others think you're a fool who's wasting time and money on animals that should be sold or put down." She paused, studying his face. "Sheriff Clayton seems to be in the first group. He speaks well of what you're accomplishing." Sheriff Clayton's visits had indeed become more frequent, though they maintained the casual pretense of checking on a new resident rather than official inspections. Tom had come to appreciate these conversations, partly because Clayton offered practical advice about ranch management, but mostly because he provided perspective from someone who remembered both Uncle Jeremiah and the Hartwell family. Your uncle was convinced that animals could sense human character better than people could, Clayton had told Tom during his most recent visit. He used to say that a man who could earn the trust of abandoned creatures probably had something worthwhile in his heart, even if he didn't know it himself. The animals were indeed beginning to show trust that went beyond mere dependence on Tom for food and care. Belle had taken to following him around the ranch like a devoted dog, nickering softly when he approached and positioning herself to provide companionship while he worked. Several of the cattle had become comfortable enough to allow him to approach and examine them without restraint. Even the more skittish sheep had begun to gather around him during feeding times, their initial wariness replaced by what could only be described as affection. But it was the moments of joy that Tom found most difficult to accept. When a mare he'd been treating for infected hooves finally walked without pain, when a calf born during his tenure took its first steady steps, when chickens gathered around his feet in obvious contentment, Tom felt something that had been absent from his life since Sarah's death: happiness. The emotion arrived unexpectedly and departed just as quickly, leaving behind a crushing weight of guilt. The guilt was sharpest during the evening hours when Tom sat on the ranch house porch reading Sarah's journal by lamplight. Her words about caring for abandoned creatures, about finding purpose in healing the broken and forgotten, seemed to prophesy exactly what Tom was now experiencing. But accepting that this life might be what Sarah had envisioned for him felt like betraying the depth of his grief, as if moving forward meant forgetting the woman who had made such moving forward possible. Dr. Morrison had begun to notice Tom's internal struggles during their conversations about animal care, which had gradually expanded to include more personal topics. Her medical training had taught her to read the signs of emotional pain, and her frontier experience had shown her that healing came in many forms. "You know," she said one afternoon as they treated a horse with a minor injury, "your uncle went through something similar when he first took over this place after the Hartwell tragedy. He felt guilty about benefiting from another family's misfortune, guilty about finding satisfaction in work that came from such sadness." Tom looked up from the horse's bandaged leg. How did he resolve it? He decided that honoring the dead meant caring for what they'd left behind, not abandoning it out of misplaced guilt, Dr. Morrison replied. The Hartwell family had loved these animals. Your uncle convinced himself that letting the ranch fail would be a greater betrayal than making it succeed. The conversation stayed with Tom through the following days as he continued his work of improving the ranch's infrastructure and the animals' living conditions. He began to see parallels between his situation and Uncle Jeremiah's, but also differences that mattered. Uncle Jeremiah had inherited the ranch as a business partner, with no personal connection to loss. Tom's inheritance was intertwined with Sarah's dreams in ways that made both the opportunity and the responsibility more complex. The turning point came during a particularly difficult night when one of the older cattle was struggling with what appeared to be a birthing complication. Tom had seen enough difficult births during his ranch work to know when human intervention was necessary, but he'd never been solely responsible for the outcome. Using Uncle Jeremiah's veterinary tools and following the detailed instructions in the medical kit, Tom spent 4 hours assisting the cow through a delivery that might have killed both mother and calf without help. When the calf finally arrived, healthy and strong, and the mother began the instinctive process of cleaning and bonding with her newborn, Tom felt a rush of satisfaction and accomplishment that he couldn't dismiss as inappropriate. This wasn't happiness that dishonored Sarah's memory. This was the fulfillment of dreams she'd held for both of them. Sitting in the barn as dawn approached, watching the new mother tend to her calf, while other animals moved quietly through their morning routines, Tom finally began to understand what Sarah had seen in her vision of caring for abandoned creatures. It wasn't just about the animals, it was about the healing that occurred in the person who chose to care for them, despite the difficulty, the uncertainty, and the risk of loss. For the first time since Sarah's death, Tom allowed himself to imagine a future that extended beyond mere survival. Tom might never have found the safe if Belle hadn't developed an unusual obsession with a particular section of the barn wall. For 3 days running, the old mare had approached the same spot near the feed storage area, sniffing and pawing at the wooden planks with a persistence that seemed almost purposeful. Tom had initially dismissed it as quirky behavior, but when Belle began to whinny and paw more vigorously whenever he worked nearby, he decided to investigate what was capturing her attention. The planks looked identical to the rest of the barn's weathered siding, but when Tom pressed against them, he discovered that one section moved slightly under pressure. Further examination revealed a cleverly disguised panel that had been cut and refinished to blend seamlessly with the surrounding wood. Behind the panel, set into the barn's thick support beam, was an iron safe that looked like it belonged in a bank rather than a rural outbuilding. The safe was old but well-maintained, with combination dials that moved smoothly despite their obvious age. Tom stared at it for several minutes, wondering what Uncle Jeremiah had felt the need to protect so carefully. The most obvious answer would be money or valuable documents, but something about the safe's placement and concealment suggested it contained items of more personal significance. Tom tried various number combinations based on dates he knew from Uncle Jeremiah's life, the year he'd inherited the ranch, the year the Hartwell family had died, the year Tom himself was born. None of them worked. Finally, acting on intuition he couldn't explain, Tom tried Sarah's birthday, a date his uncle should have had no reason to know. The tumblers clicked into place, and the safe door swung open. Inside, Tom found a collection of items that made his hands tremble as he lifted them out. A bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon, several legal documents bearing official seals, a small wooden box carved with roses, and a sealed envelope marked, "For Thomas McKenna, to be opened after my death." Tom opened the envelope first, unfolding pages covered with Uncle Jeremiah's careful handwriting. "My dear nephew, if you are reading this, then my plan has worked, and you have found your way to Blackwater Ranch. I pray that you have also found your way to some measure of peace, though I know that Sarah's loss has been devastating for you. Yes, Thomas, I knew about Sarah's death, and I knew about your grief, because your remarkable wife had been writing to me for over 2 years before her illness took her from you." Tom's vision blurred as he read those words. Sarah had been corresponding with Uncle Jeremiah? She'd never mentioned it, never hinted that she'd established contact with his distant relative. The letter continued. "Sarah wrote to me after she discovered my address among your father's papers. She told me about her dreams of creating a sanctuary for abandoned animals, about her belief that caring for helpless creatures was a form of healing for the caregiver as much as the cared for. Her letters were full of love for you, Thomas, and concern about the sadness she saw in your eyes even during your happiest moments together." Tom set the letter down, his hands shaking too badly to continue reading. He reached for the bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon, Sarah's favorite color, and untied it with fingers that felt clumsy and disconnected. The top letter was in Sarah's handwriting, addressed to dear Uncle Jeremiah, and dated just 3 months before her final illness. "I hope you will forgive my boldness in writing to you, but Tom has spoken of you often, and I feel that you might understand something that I struggle to explain to others. I have dreams of a place where Tom and I could take in animals that others have given up on. Horses too old to work, cattle too injured to be profitable, creatures that are seen as burdens rather than blessings. Tom doesn't know how deeply I hold this dream because I fear he would see it as impractical, but I believe God places certain desires in our hearts for reasons we may not immediately understand." Tom read through letter after letter, watching his wife's dreams unfold in careful handwriting. Sarah had shared details about their daily life, about her observations of Tom's character, about her certainty that he possessed a capacity for nurturing that he'd never been allowed to fully express. Uncle Jeremiah's responses, written on the back of several letters, showed a man who understood both Sarah's vision and Tom's potential, but it was the final letter in the bundle that brought Tom to his knees on the barn floor. Dated just 1 week before Sarah's illness began, it contained news that she'd apparently never found the opportunity to share. "Dear Uncle Jeremiah, I have wonderful news that I haven't yet told Tom. I am with child, and the doctor believes about 10 weeks along. Tom will be such a wonderful father. He has such gentleness with helpless creatures, such patience with things that need tending. I plan to tell him tonight, and I know his joy will be boundless. This child will grow up on a ranch where every living thing is valued and protected. I can see it all so clearly, Uncle Jeremiah, and I know you understand why these dreams matter so much to me." Tom's sobs echoed through the empty barn as the full weight of what he'd lost became clear. Not just Sarah, but the child she'd carried, the family they would have built together, the ranch full of rescued animals where their children would have learned about compassion and responsibility. Sarah had died before she could share the news of her pregnancy, and Tom had spent 6 months grieving a loss even greater than he'd known. But Uncle Jeremiah's final letter provided context that transformed grief into something more complex. "Thomas, I arranged this inheritance specifically to give you the chance to fulfill Sarah's dreams, even though she could not be here to share them with you. The animals you have found at Blackwater Ranch are her legacy as much as mine. Every creature you save, every life you improve, every moment of healing you provide is a continuation of the love she felt for abandoned and forgotten things. The wooden box contained items that confirmed Uncle Jeremiah's planning: correspondence with lawyers about structuring the inheritance, communications with William Santos about maintaining the animals until Tom's arrival, and most shocking of all, a copy of a bank draft transferring significant funds to an account established in Tom's name. Uncle Jeremiah had not only left him the ranch and its animals, he'd provided the financial resources necessary to operate it properly. The legal documents revealed the full scope of the inheritance, not just the ranch property, but water rights, grazing leases, and investments that would generate ongoing income sufficient to support the animal sanctuary that Sarah had envisioned. Uncle Jeremiah had spent the final years of his life converting his wealth into a trust that would allow Tom to carry forward Sarah's dreams without financial concern. As Tom sat surrounded by letters and documents in the dusty barn, Belle approached and rested her head against his shoulder in what felt like a gesture of comfort. The other animals had sensed something significant happening and had gathered nearby, creating a circle of patient, watchful faces that waited for Tom to process what he'd discovered. The revelation reframed everything Tom had experienced since arriving at Blackwater Ranch. This wasn't a chance inheritance that had accidentally provided him with purpose. It was Sarah's final gift to him, carefully orchestrated through correspondence with the uncle who shared her vision. Every animal he'd treated, every repair he'd made, every moment of satisfaction he'd felt was part of a plan that Sarah had helped create. Tom picked up Uncle Jeremiah's final letter and read the conclusion. "You may wonder why I never contacted you directly after Sarah's death, why I allowed you to drift for 6 months before the lawyers found you. The answer is that Sarah made me promise to wait until you were ready to receive this gift. She said that grief had to run its course before healing could begin, and that you would know when you were ready to care for something other than your own pain. The fact that you are reading this letter tells me that Sarah's timing, as always, was perfect." Standing in the barn surrounded by the animals that had been waiting for him, holding letters that revealed a conspiracy of love between his wife and his uncle, Tom finally understood that his presence at Blackwater Ranch was not an accident or even an inheritance in the traditional sense. It was a resurrection of Sarah's dreams, of his own capacity for joy, and of the possibility that love could continue to create meaning even after death had claimed its most important architect. The formal notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by Sheriff Clayton with an expression that mixed apologetic duty with personal regret. Tom read the official language twice before its meaning fully registered. The citizens of Millfield were calling for a public hearing to address concerns about the irregular animal accumulation at the Blackwater Ranch property and its potential impact on community welfare, property values, and public health. "I'm sorry about this, Tom," Clayton said, settling into the chair Tom had placed on the ranch house porch for his increasingly frequent visits. "There's been talk in town for weeks, and it finally reached the point where Mayor Davidson felt compelled to make it official." Tom folded the notice carefully, his mind already working through the implications. "Who's behind it?" "Garrett's been the most vocal," Clayton replied, referring to the rancher who'd questioned Tom's competence from the beginning. "Claims you're harboring diseased animals that could spread sickness to legitimate livestock operations. Mrs. Whitmore thinks the ranch is attracting predators that might threaten children. And there are property owners who believe having 200 animals next door affects their land values." "And what do you think?" Tom asked, though he suspected he knew Clayton's position from their recent conversations. Clayton was quiet for a moment, looking out over the pasture where Tom's animals grazed peacefully in the morning sun. "I think you've done something remarkable here. Those animals are healthier and better cared for than livestock on half the working ranches in this county. but I also think you need to be prepared to defend what you've built, because not everyone sees it the way I do." The hearing was scheduled for the following Saturday evening at the schoolhouse, giving Tom less than a week to prepare a defense for something he'd never expected to have to justify. As he considered his options, Tom realized that the hearing represented more than just a legal challenge to his right to operate the ranch. It was a test of whether he was truly ready to commit to the life that Sarah and Uncle Jeremiah had envisioned. For him, Tom's first step was to document everything he'd accomplished since arriving at Blackwater Ranch. He spent 2 days creating a detailed inventory of the animals, their health improvements, and the medical treatments he'd administered. Using Uncle Jeremiah's veterinary notebook and his own careful observations, Tom compiled records that demonstrated not just the animals' current condition, but the remarkable progress they'd made under proper care. Dr. Morrison proved invaluable in this effort, providing medical documentation that would carry weight with townspeople who might question Tom's credibility. She spent an entire afternoon examining animals and creating official health assessments that painted a picture of responsible animal husbandry rather than reckless hoarding. These records show animals that are not only healthy, but thriving, she told Tom as they completed their documentation. Any veterinarian would be impressed with the care they're receiving. She paused, studying Tom's face with the attention she usually reserved for diagnosing illness. "But you know this hearing isn't really about animal health, don't you?" Tom nodded. He'd realized that the opposition to his ranch was rooted in something deeper than practical concerns about livestock management. For some townspeople, his operation represented change, unconventional thinking, and a challenge to assumptions about how resources should be used. The fact that he was an outsider who'd inherited rather than earned his position only added to the suspicion. "What it's really about," Dr. Morrison continued, "is whether this community will support someone who's trying to do something different, something that doesn't fit the usual patterns of frontier life." Tom's preparation extended beyond documentation to personal reflection. Each evening, after completing his animal care routines, he sat on the ranch house porch with Sarah's journal, reading passages that seemed to speak directly to his current situation. Her words about the connection between healing animals and healing oneself had taken on new meaning since his discovery of their correspondence with Uncle Jeremiah. "The people who matter will see the value in what you're trying to accomplish," she'd written in one particularly prescient passage. "The people who don't matter will focus on reasons why it can't work. Your job is to know the difference between those two groups and to speak to the first, while not being discouraged by the second." As the hearing approached, Tom found himself facing a decision that went beyond defending his legal right to keep the animals. He had to decide whether he was truly ready to publicly commit to a future that differed so dramatically from the aimless drifting that had defined his life since Sarah's death. The hearing would require him to articulate not just what he'd accomplished, but what he intended to continue accomplishing. Dr. Morrison's support provided crucial encouragement, but Tom knew that her advocacy came with personal risk. As the town's only physician, she depended on community goodwill for her professional success. Standing with Tom against vocal opposition could affect her practice, yet she'd never hesitated to offer her backing. "I've watched you work with those animals," she told Tom during one of their planning sessions. "I've seen how they respond to you, how they've learned to trust again after being abandoned. That kind of healing doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone cares enough to make it happen." Sheriff Clayton maintained official neutrality, but his private conversations with Tom revealed a man wrestling with his own convictions about justice and community responsibility. "I can't take sides publicly," Clayton explained, "but I can make sure the hearing is conducted fairly, that both sides get heard properly." Tom spent considerable time preparing his presentation, but he also spent time simply observing the animals that had become the center of the controversy. Their daily routines had evolved into a complex social ecosystem where horses provided leadership, cattle offered protection, and smaller animals found security within the larger community. Watching them interact, Tom realized he wasn't just caring for individual creatures. He was maintaining a functioning society that had learned to thrive despite abandonment and neglect. 3 days before the hearing, Tom received unexpected support from an unlikely source. Mrs. Henderson arrived at the ranch with a group of children from town, including several who had been visiting regularly to help with feeding and to observe the animals. The children had created a petition supporting Tom's work, signed by their parents and other community members who had come to see the ranch as a positive addition to Millfield. These children have learned more about responsibility and compassion in the past 2 months than some adults learn in a lifetime, Mrs. Henderson told Tom as they watched the youngsters interact fearlessly with animals that had once been too traumatized to trust humans. Their parents see that too. The night before the hearing, Tom wrote what he intended to be his final letter to Sarah's memory. "My dearest Sarah, tomorrow I will stand before the people of Millfield and defend the dream you held for both of us. I know now that this ranch, these animals, this opportunity to create something meaningful from abandonment and loss, all of it came from your love and your vision of who I could become. I'm no longer the man who rode away from our homestead. 6 months ago, broken by grief and convinced that purpose had died with you, I've learned that love doesn't end with death. It transforms into something that can create healing for others. If I succeed tomorrow, it will be because I've finally become worthy of the faith you placed in me. If I fail, it will be because I waited too long to believe in myself the way you always believed in me. Either way, I want you to know that these months at Blackwater Ranch have given me back something I thought I'd lost forever, the ability to hope for a future that honors the past without being imprisoned by it. I love you, Sarah. I always will, but I'm finally ready to live the life you dreamed for both of us, even if I must live it alone." As Tom prepared for sleep that final night, he found himself surrounded by animals who seemed to sense the importance of the coming day. Belle stood guard near the porch, while other horses gathered in the yard closer than their usual nighttime positions. Even the cattle had moved nearer to the ranch house, creating a protective circle that felt both coincidental and purposeful. Tom understood that tomorrow's hearing would determine more than just his right to remain at Blackwater Ranch. It would determine whether a community was ready to embrace a different definition of valuable work, whether compassion for abandoned creatures could be recognized as legitimate purpose, and whether a man who had lost everything could find acceptance for the new identity he'd discovered among the forgotten and discarded. The wooden gavel that would call the hearing to order sat in Mayor Davidson's office, waiting to begin proceedings that would change Tom's life one way or another. But as Tom drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the sounds of animals who trusted him to protect their sanctuary, he realized that regardless of tomorrow's outcome, he had already become the man Sarah had believed he could be. The Millfield schoolhouse had never held so many people at once. Every chair was occupied, and additional residents stood along the walls, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that felt more like a revival meeting than a municipal hearing. Tom sat in the front row, acutely aware of the conversations happening behind him in tones that ranged from supportive whispers to outright skepticism. Mayor Davidson called the meeting to order with 3 sharp strikes of his gavel, a piece of carved oak that had been used for town business since Millfield's incorporation 15 years earlier. The sound echoed through the packed room, immediately silencing the murmur of conversation and focusing everyone's attention on the matter at hand. "We're here tonight to address concerns raised by several citizens about the animal operation at the Blackwater Ranch," Davidson announced, consulting notes written in his careful script. "Both sides will have the opportunity to present their positions. after which we'll hold a community vote on whether to support Mr. McKenna's continued operation or to recommend that he reduce the number of animals to levels more consistent with traditional ranching practices. Garrett spoke first for the opposition, his presentation clearly rehearsed and methodically delivered. He outlined concerns about property values, citing examples from other towns where unusual land use had affected neighboring property sales. His argument was logical and well-researched, touching on issues of noise, odor, and the potential for disease transmission that could affect other livestock operations in the area. Mrs. Whitmore followed with emotional testimony about safety concerns, particularly the risk that Tom's large animal population might attract predators closer to town. She spoke passionately about protecting children, invoking worst-case scenarios that seemed designed to frighten rather than inform. The opposition's final speaker was a land speculator named Morrison, no relation to Dr. Morrison, who had been quietly purchasing property around Millfield with plans for development. His concern was purely economic. Tom's unconventional ranch operation created uncertainty that could discourage future investment in the area. When Tom's turn came, he walked to the front of the room, carrying a leather portfolio that Dr. Morrison had helped him organize. His hands were steady, despite the weight of so many stairs, and his voice carried clearly as he began to speak. 6 months ago, I inherited property I'd never seen and responsibility I'd never sought, Tom began. I came to Blackwater Ranch expecting to find an abandoned piece of land that I could quickly sell. Instead, I found more than 200 animals that had been surviving through their own resourcefulness and the care of a devoted ranch hand who could no longer manage the work alone. Tom opened his portfolio and began presenting the documentation he'd compiled: health records showing animal recoveries, medical assessments from Dr. Morrison confirming the absence of disease, and financial records demonstrating that the ranch operation was economically self-sufficient. His presentation was thorough but personal, focusing not just on statistics, but on individual animals whose conditions had improved dramatically under proper care. These animals aren't just livestock, Tom continued. They're individuals with personalities, relationships, and the capacity to heal from trauma when given the chance. They've taught me that abandonment doesn't have to mean hopelessness, and that caring for the forgotten can restore purpose to those who feel lost. Dr. Morrison's medical testimony provided crucial support for Tom's position. She presented clinical evidence of the animal's health, comparing their current condition to their state when Tom had first arrived. Her professional credibility and detailed documentation effectively countered the opposition's claims about disease risk, but it was the testimony of Mrs. Henderson and the group of children she'd brought that created the evening's most powerful moment. 10-year-old Jenny Martinez stood before the room of adults and spoke with the clarity that only children possess about important matters. Mr. McKenna taught us that every animal matters, even the old ones and the hurt ones, she said, her voice clear and confident. He showed us how to feed the chickens without scaring them and how to brush the horses so they feel loved. The animals aren't dangerous, they're grateful. The petition the children had created contained 37 signatures from families who supported Tom's work, many of whom had visited the ranch and witnessed the animal's condition firsthand. Parents spoke about the lessons their children had learned about responsibility and compassion, about the value of seeing successful rehabilitation of creatures that others had given up on. Tom's final statement was personal rather than political. "These animals saved my life," he said simply. "I came here broken by grief, convinced that I had no purpose left. They taught me that healing happens when we choose to care for something beyond ourselves, even when that caring is difficult and uncertain." As Tom returned to his seat, he noticed movement outside the schoolhouse windows. In the gathering dusk, animals from his ranch had somehow made their way to the edge of town. Belle stood at the front of a group that included horses, cattle, and even some of the braver sheep, all of them silent and watchful, as if they understood that their fate was being decided inside the building. Mayor Davidson called for the vote, and the room fell into the kind of silence that precedes moments that change everything. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, before Mayor Davidson began calling for the vote. All in favor of supporting Mr. McKenna's continued operation of Blackwater Ranch as currently constituted. Hands rose throughout the room, some immediately, others after brief hesitation. Tom forced himself to breathe as Davidson counted, his expression revealing nothing about the tally he was recording. Dr. Morrison's hand was among the first raised, followed by Mrs. Henderson, Sheriff Clayton, and many of the parents whose children had visited the ranch. All opposed. A smaller number of hands rose, including Garrett's and Mrs. Whitmore's, but Tom was surprised to see that several people he'd expected to vote against him remained seated with their hands down, not supporting, but not actively opposing either. Davidson completed his count twice before announcing the results. By a vote of 41 in favor and 28 opposed, with 6 abstentions, the community of Millfield officially supports Mr. McKenna's continued operation of Blackwater Ranch. The immediate aftermath was a mixture of celebration and awkward congratulations. Supporters surrounded Tom with handshakes and promises of assistance, while those who had opposed him maintained polite distance but offered grudging nods of acceptance. Garrett approached as the crowd began to thin, extending his hand with obvious reluctance. "You won fair and square," he said. "I still think you're taking on more than you can handle, but I respect the community's decision. If you need advice about managing that many animals, I'm willing to help." The offer surprised Tom, representing a grace he hadn't expected from his most vocal opponent. He shook Garrett's hand gratefully, understanding that frontier communities required people to work together regardless of their differences. Mrs. Whitmore's concession was more formal, but equally significant. "I pray you'll prove my concerns." "Unfounded," she said. "The children clearly adore what you're doing, and I suppose that counts for something." As the schoolhouse emptied, Tom found himself holding the deed to Blackwater Ranch that Uncle Jeremiah's lawyer had provided months earlier. The document had been merely legal paperwork before tonight, but the community's vote had transformed it into something more meaningful. Official recognition of his right to continue the work that Sarah and Uncle Jeremiah had envisioned. Dr. Morrison walked with Tom toward his horse, their conversation turning to practical matters now that the political battle was resolved. "You'll need to establish formal procedures for the ranch operation," she advised. "Documentation, regular health inspections, perhaps guided tours so people can see the animals' condition for themselves." "I'd like to make it official," Tom said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Not just a ranch, but a recognized animal sanctuary. Somewhere people can bring animals that need help, somewhere children can learn about caring for creatures that others have given up on." The ride back to Blackwater Ranch felt different than any journey Tom had taken since arriving in Texas. For the first time, he was traveling not just to a place where he worked, but to a home that had been validated by community support. The animals that had gathered near town were already making their way back to the ranch, creating a procession that felt both celebratory and purposeful. Belle met Tom at the ranch gate, nickering softly and nuzzling his shoulder as he dismounted. Other animals gathered in the yard, and Tom felt their presence as a form of celebration, as if they understood that the threat to their sanctuary had been resolved. He moved among them, offering gentle touches and quiet words of reassurance, feeling a connection that went deeper than the practical relationship between caretaker and charges. That night, Tom sat on the ranch house porch with Sarah's journal, open in his lap, but he didn't read from it. Instead, he carefully removed the wedding ring that had hung on a chain around his neck since her death. The ring had been a symbol of loss, a physical reminder of everything he'd left behind. Now, as he placed it gently inside the journal's front cover, it became something different, a symbol of love that had created new life even after death. Tom closed the journal and set it on the table beside his chair, where it would remain as a treasured record rather than a source of daily grief. The wedding ring would stay with Sarah's words, but Tom would no longer carry it as a weight around his neck. The love it represented had evolved from memory into mission, from past into future. Standing in the ranch yard under a sky full of stars, surrounded by animals who had learned to trust again after abandonment, Tom felt the final pieces of his transformation settle into place. He was no longer Tom McKenna the drifter, working temporary jobs to avoid facing his loss. He was Tom McKenna the sanctuary keeper, protector of the forgotten, healer of the abandoned. Tomorrow, he would begin planning the official transformation of Blackwater Ranch into a recognized animal sanctuary. Tonight, he would simply stand among the creatures who had saved his life and accept the identity they had helped him discover. The sign at the entrance to Blackwater Ranch had been crafted by the same blacksmith who had made the original gate, his skilled hands creating letters that would weather decades of frontier seasons. Blackwater Animal Sanctuary, in memory of Sarah McKenna, established 1881. Below the main text, in smaller script, were the words that had become the sanctuary's unofficial motto: "Every living thing deserves a chance." 6 months had passed since the town meeting that had secured Tom's right to continue his work, and the transformation had exceeded even his most optimistic expectations. The ranch now housed over 250 animals, including new arrivals that came from throughout the region as word spread about the sanctuary, where abandoned and injured creatures could find healing and permanent homes. Tom had become Millfield's unofficial animal rescue coordinator, working with other ranchers to provide temporary or permanent care for livestock that had been injured, orphaned, or simply worn out by years of service. Dr. Morrison had established regular veterinary clinics at the ranch, treating not only sanctuary animals, but also providing affordable care for pet owners who couldn't afford the journey to Austin for professional services. Their partnership had evolved far beyond the initial medical consultations that had brought Dr. Morrison to Blackwater Ranch. She now spent 2 days each week at the sanctuary, combining her medical practice with hands-on animal care that had rekindled her own sense of purpose. Their friendship had deepened into something that felt both comfortable and full of possibility, though neither had yet spoken explicitly about the growing affection that others in town had begun to notice. The morning routine that had once overwhelmed Tom, with its scope and responsibility, had become a source of daily satisfaction. He moved through the feeding stations with the confidence of someone who knew each animal individually, could recognize the subtle signs of illness or distress, and understood the complex social dynamics that governed the sanctuary's thriving community. Belle, now showing her advanced age, but still serving as the unofficial leader among the horses, had claimed a special place near the ranch house where she could observe Tom's daily activities. Her presence had become a form of benediction, a reminder of the trust that had first drawn him into full commitment to the sanctuary's mission. The financial aspects of the operation had stabilized through a combination of Uncle Jeremiah's inheritance, community donations, and the modest fees Tom charged for boarding animals whose owners needed temporary care. He had also begun accepting visitors who wanted to see the sanctuary's work, creating an additional revenue stream while educating the public about animal welfare and rescue. But it was the personal transformation that most amazed Tom when he allowed himself to reflect on the journey that had brought him to this point. The man who had ridden away from his homestead in Colorado, broken by grief and convinced that purpose had died with his wife, had been replaced by someone who woke each morning eager to begin the day's work, surrounded by creatures who depended on his care and rewarded it with trust and affection. On a crisp morning in late autumn, Tom made the journey he had been postponing for months. The ride to Sarah's grave in Colorado took 3 days, carrying him through landscape that had once seemed colored only by loss, but now appeared painted with possibility. He brought Sarah's journal, but also a letter describing everything that had happened since he'd last visited her resting place. The cemetery looked smaller than Tom remembered, and Sarah's headstone had weathered to a soft gray that seemed to blend naturally with the prairie surroundings. Tom sat beside her grave, as he had done many times before, but this visit felt different from all the others. He wasn't coming to her from a place of desperation or confusion, but from a life that had found its proper direction. "Sarah," he said aloud, opening her journal to passages he had long since memorized, "I came to tell you that your dreams came true, just not in the way either of us expected." He read to her from her own words about caring for abandoned animals, about the healing that occurs in the caregiver as much as the cared for, about the belief that every living thing deserves a chance at happiness. "There are more than 250 animals at Blackwater Ranch now," he continued. "Belle is still there, still watching over everyone like she watched over me when I first arrived. Dr. Morrison has become a true partner in the work, and I think you would have liked her. She has your gentleness with frightened creatures, your patience with healing that takes time." Tom closed the journal and sat quietly for several minutes, feeling Sarah's presence not as the aching absence that had defined his grief, but as the continuing influence of love that had created meaning beyond its own ending. The guilt that had once made happiness feel like betrayal had been replaced by gratitude for the woman whose vision had given his life direction even after her death. The journey back to Texas felt like returning home rather than traveling to a temporary stopping place. As Tom crested the hill that provided the first view of Blackwater Ranch, he saw the familiar sight of animals scattered across pastures that showed the careful management of someone who understood both their practical needs and their emotional requirements. Dr. Morrison was waiting on the ranch house porch, having arrived during his absence to check on several animals that were recovering from recent ailments. Her smile as he dismounted and approached the house carried warmth that went beyond professional courtesy or casual friendship. "How was your journey?" she asked, and Tom heard in the question genuine care for his emotional well-being as much as curiosity about his travels. "Peaceful," Tom replied, and realized that for the first time since Sarah's death, the word described not just a temporary state, but a fundamental condition of his life. "I told her about everything we've built here, about the animals we've saved, about the community we've created." As the sun set over Blackwater Ranch, Tom stood in the yard, surrounded by creatures who had learned to trust again after abandonment, working alongside a woman who understood the healing power of caring for the forgotten. The sanctuary that had begun as Sarah's dream and Uncle Jeremiah's bequest had become something larger, a testament to love's ability to create meaning that transcends individual lives and touches everyone willing to participate in the patient work of healing. In the gathering dusk, with animals settling into their evening routines and the promise of tomorrow's purpose already stirring in his heart, Tom McKenna had finally come home.